The ballroom of the Do-Jae estate was a sea of silk, shadows, and whispered treacheries. I moved through the crowd with the practiced grace of a woman who had spent 2 years perfecting the art of being invisible. My back was straight, my expression a mask of warm, professional serenity that gave nothing away. I was the head maid, the silent guardian of the estate's hospitality, and my only goal was to ensure the night ended without blood staining the marble floors. But then I felt him. Not Yoon Do-Jae, whose presence I could track like a compass needle finding north, but his shadow Baek Min-Joon. Min-Joon didn't follow the rules of the house. He moved with a calculated, smooth confidence that felt like a direct insult to the rigid order Do-Jae demanded. As I reached for a discarded flute on a nearby terrace table, he drifted into my space. He didn't just stand near me. He invaded the very air I breathed, positioning himself so that I was trapped between his sharply tailored frame and the stone balustrade. "Sandalwood and rain," Min-Joon murmured, his voice a low melodic caress that made the hair on my arms stand up. He didn't wait for a response. He leaned in, closing the distance until his nose was inches from the curve of my neck. I froze, my heart hammering against my ribs, but my face remained a statue of calm. I've spent the entire night wondering what the most beautiful woman in Seoul smelled like. It turns out, she smells like a secret. He inhaled deeply, a slow, provocative tilt of his head that was designed for an audience of 20 feet away. The air in the room seemed to freeze. I didn't have to look to know that Do-Jae was watching. I could feel the heat of his stare, a piercing, lethal brand that burned through the back of my dress. He had been standing with the city's elite, the perfect image of a cold, untouchable billionaire. But the man behind the suit was a predator who had just seen a trespasser in his territory. The sound that followed was sharp, a violent, crystalline snap that cut through the low hum of the orchestra. I turned my head just enough to see Do-Jae's hand. He was still standing rigid, his jaw clenched so tight a muscle jumped in his cheek. But the expensive wine glass he had been holding was gone, reduced to a jagged explosion of shards in his bare palm. Dark crimson liquid, a mixture of vintage Bordeaux and his own blood, began to drip steadily onto the white marble floor. He didn't flinch. He didn't look at his hand. His eyes, dark and full of a savage, barely contained fury, were locked onto Min-Joon's lingering touch on my shoulder. The savage had officially lost his grip. And I knew then that the fortress of silence I had built for 2 years had just been leveled to the ground. To live in the shadow of Yoon Do-Jae was to live in a world governed by the rhythm of silence. For 2 years, I had occupied the space between the marble walls and the expensive tapestries of his Seoul estate, moving with the quiet efficiency of a ghost. In this house, silence was not merely the absence of sound. It was a survival strategy, a fortress I had built stone by stone until I was certain I had become a permanent part of the architecture. My life was defined by 3 unbreakable rules, a triptych of boundaries that kept the savage at bay. Rule 1. Never engage with the men who arrived at 3 a.m. in black SUVs, the ones whose hands were too scarred and whose eyes were too empty. Rule 2. Maintain a mask of perfect, stoic serenity, regardless of the violence that hummed just beneath the surface of the household. Rule 3. Never, under any circumstances, allow Yoon Do-Jae to see me as anything more than the woman who ensured his shirts were crisp and his espresso was served at precisely the temperature he preferred. For 730 days, I had been the perfect shadow. I knew the exact weight of his footsteps on the hardwood, the specific way he exhaled when a deal had gone south, and the dark, metallic scent of the cologne he wore like armor. I moved through his private sanctum with a tray in my hands and my eyes cast down, performing a dance of invisibility that I believed would keep my heart safe. But invisibility is a double-edged sword. While I spent those years pretending I was nothing more than a ghost, I became a master at observing the man who owned the house. I saw the things the rest of the world was too terrified to look at. I saw the way he rubbed his left temple when the business grew too loud. I saw the poetry journals he hid in the bottom drawer of his mahogany desk. Verses written in a jagged, desperate script that spoke of a man who felt everything and admitted to nothing. Most of all, I saw the stares. It started 6 months into my service. I had been polishing the silver in the dining hall, the late afternoon sun casting long, amber streaks across the room. I thought I was alone. I allowed my shoulders to drop, a soft hum escaping my lips, a melody from home that I usually kept locked away. When I turned to leave, I saw him. Do-Jae was standing in the shadows of the arched doorway, his coat draped over one arm, his body as rigid as a sentinel. He wasn't moving. He was simply watching me. His gaze wasn't the casual look of a master checking on a servant. It was intense, a dark and piercing weight that felt like a physical touch against my skin. In that moment, the mask of the savage had slipped, replaced by something raw and hunger-driven that made the silver tray tremble in my hands. He didn't speak. He didn't acknowledge my presence with a nod or a command. He simply stood there until I hurried past him, his eyes following the curve of my spine with a heat that lingered long after I had reached the safety of the servants' quarters. From that day on, the fortress of silence began to feel less like a sanctuary and more like a cage. I would find him watching me in the reflections of the floor-to-ceiling windows while I served dinner. I would feel his eyes on the back of my neck while I organized his library, the air between us thick with a tension that neither of us dared to name. He was a man who took what he wanted with iron and blood, yet with me he stayed in the shadows, his possessiveness manifesting in secret glances, and the way his jaw would tighten whenever I stood too close to set his coffee down. I told myself it was a professional interest. I told myself he was merely ensuring his estate was run with the precision he demanded. But as I stood on the terrace during the gala, feeling the lethal chill of his gaze while a rival touched my skin, I finally had to admit the truth. The silence hadn't been a shield at all. It had been the fuse, and tonight, the world was finally going to watch it burn. The air in the dining hall was so thick with unspoken threats that it felt as though the mere act of breathing required effort. This was meant to be a peace dinner, a strategic ceasefire in a war that had been bleeding the city dry for months, but the setting was far from tranquil. I moved around the long mahogany table, my footsteps muffled by the heavy Persian rug, ensuring that every piece of silverware was aligned with surgical precision. I knew this truce was a lie. Yoon Do-Jae did not make peace. He merely waited for the most advantageous moment to strike. Across from him, Baek Min-Joon sat with a posture that was a direct provocation. Relaxed, sprawling, and entirely too comfortable in a house that wanted him dead. Min-Joon was a different kind of monster than my employer. Where Do-Jae was a storm of ice and shadow, Min-Joon was a slick, oily heat. He watched me as I poured the first course of wine, his gaze not following the liquid, but tracking the movement of my hands. I kept my face a mask of professional stoicism, my eyes focused on the rim of the crystal, but I could feel the temperature in the room dropping with every second Min-Joon lingered on my form. "You've always had an impeccable eye for assets, Do-Jae," Min-Joon said, his voice smooth and melodic, cutting through the heavy silence. He didn't look at the man he was addressing. Instead, he leaned back, his eyes raking over me as I moved to his side to set down a gold-rimmed plate. "But I had no idea you were hiding something so exquisite in these cold halls." I didn't flinch, but the air around Do-Jae seemed to vibrate. Across the table, Do-Jae didn't even pick up his glass. He sat perfectly rigid, his hands flat on the table, his jaw clenched so tight the muscles in his neck were strained like bridge cables. "The dinner is for business, Min-Joon," Do-Jae said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that sounded like grinding stone. "Keep your tongue on the agenda." Min-Joon laughed, a light, mocking sound that echoed off the high ceilings. He ignored the warning entirely. As I reached forward to adjust the water goblet near his hand, he moved with a sudden, calculated grace, his fingers brushing against the back of my hand. It was a brief, light contact, but in this house, it was an act of war. "A woman like this shouldn't be relegated to the shadows," Min-Joon continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper as he looked up at me. He smiled, a charming, predatory expression that told me he knew exactly what he was doing. He wasn't flirting with me because he wanted me. He was flirting with me because he knew I was the only thing in the world that could make Yoon Do-Jae lose his mind. "Tell me, darling, Does he even notice the way you light up a room? Or are you just another piece of furniture to him? I maintained my composure, drawing my hand back and stepping into the shadows where I belonged. I am the head maid of this estate, Mr. Baek, I replied, my voice calm and quietly confident. My role is to ensure your comfort, nothing more. A tragedy, Min-Joon sighed, his eyes flicking back to Do-Jae, who looked as though he were moments away from leaping across the table and tearing Min-Joon's throat out. If you were in my house, you wouldn't be carrying trays. You'd be sitting at the head of the table. You deserve someone who appreciates the fire behind that calm mask. The sound of Do-Jae's silver knife scraping against the porcelain plate was like a scream. He didn't look at me, but his knuckles were bone-white as he gripped the handle. The savage was no longer submerged. He was right at the surface, his piercing stare fixed on his rival with a lethal promise. Min-Joon had achieved his goal. He had found the one crack in Do-Jae's iron discipline, and as I retreated toward the kitchen to prepare the next course, I realized that the piece was already over. The rival had made his move, and the man I served was about to show the world just how savage he could truly be. The screech of Do-Jae's chair against the marble was a sound of absolute finality. It wasn't the sound of a man ending a meal. It was the sound of a predator deciding the hunt was over. Min-Joon was still smiling, his hand still lingering near where mine had been. But the amusement in his eyes flickered and died as he looked up. Do-Jae didn't just stand. He surged, the movement so fluid and lethal it felt like the air in the room had been sucked into his wake. Before Min-Joon could offer another witty provocation, the cold, black barrel of a semi-automatic was pressed firmly against his temple. The silence that followed was heavy, punctuated only by the steady drip of blood and wine from Do-Jae's shattered palm onto the tablecloth. He didn't seem to feel the glass shards still embedded in his skin. His entire being was focused on the man sitting at his table. "Get out," Do-Jae said. It wasn't a shout. It was a low, guttural vibration that seemed to shake the very foundations of the estate. "If you breathe another word, if you even think about looking toward her again, I will end this truce in the most permanent way possible." Min-Joon's smooth confidence finally cracked. He raised his hand slowly, the charm on his face replaced by a stark, sudden realization that he had pushed the savage too far. He had wanted a reaction, but he hadn't prepared for a man who was willing to burn down a multi-million-dollar alliance over a touch. "Careful, Do-Jae," Min-Joon whispered, though his voice lacked its earlier oily heat. "Your weakness is showing." "My weakness is my business," Do-Jae replied, the gun clicking as he disengaged the safety. "Your life is mine. Go. Now." Min-Joon stood, moving with a haste that betrayed his fear, and retreated from the dining hall without another word. The heavy double doors slammed shut behind him, the sound echoing like a cannon blast through the hollow silence of the house. I stood frozen in the corner, my hands clasped tightly in front of my apron. I had seen Do-Jae violent before. I had heard the stories of why they called him the savage. But I had never been the eye of his storm. I kept my gaze fixed on a point on the wall, my mask of stoicism held in place by sheer will, even as my heart threatened to burst through my ribs. Do-Jae didn't put the gun away. He turned toward me, his chest heaving with a jagged, desperate rhythm. The pristine white of his dress shirt was ruined, stained with the red of the wine and the darker, thicker red of his own blood. He took a step toward me, then another, until he was towering over me, his shadow swallowing me whole. "Look at me, Isolde," he commanded. I didn't move. I couldn't. Rule 3 was the only thing keeping me upright. Never be seen as more than a shadow. He reached out with his uninjured hand, his fingers hooking under my chin to force my head up. His touch was rough, possessive, and trembling with a fury I couldn't comprehend. When my eyes finally met his, I saw the fire he had been hiding for 2 years. It was wild, dark, and utterly consuming. "Do you think I'm a fool?" he hissed, his face inches from mine. "Do you think I don't see the way they look at you? The way he looked at you?" "Mr. Yoon," I started, my voice barely a whisper. "I was merely serving the—" "You were being touched," he roared, the sound vibrating through my very bones. He slammed his bloodied hand against the wall behind my head, the glass shards rasping against the stone. In my house. At my table. You are not a ghost, Isolde. You are not a shadow. You are mine. Do you understand? Every inch of you belongs to this house. To me. I swallowed hard, the mask finally beginning to crumble at the edges. The possessiveness in his voice wasn't just about territory. It was a raw, aching admission of an obsession he could no longer contain. He looked at me as if he wanted to destroy me and protect me all at once. You invited it, he whispered, his voice cracking with a sudden, agonizing vulnerability. That smile. That calm. You let him think he could have a piece of what is mine. He leaned in closer, his forehead dropping to rest against mine. I could smell the iron of his blood and the sharp scent of his cologne. For 2 years we had lived in the fortress of silence, but tonight, the walls hadn't just been breached, they had been incinerated. The savage was no longer standing guard at the gate. He was inside the sanctuary, and I realized with a terrifying jolt that there was no longer any place left to hide. The morning after the dinner was not heralded by the sun, but by a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight pressing against the stone walls of the estate. I woke before the dawn, as I had for 730 days, my body moving through the familiar choreography of service. My hands, however, were not as steady as they usually were. The phantom heat of Do-Jae's bloodied hand against the wall behind my head, and the raw, jagged edge of his voice, stayed with me like a fevered dream I couldn't shake. I walked to the kitchen, my footsteps light, preparing to brew the specific, dark roast that signaled the start of his day. But when I reached the gleaming chrome of the espresso machine, I found someone else already there. She was a woman of sharp angles and even sharper efficiency. Her hair was pulled back into a bun so tight it seemed to stretch the skin of her face, and her uniform was a crisp, clinical gray that made my own black dress feel like a relic. She didn't look up when I entered. She simply moved with a robotic precision, measuring the beans with a digital scale. I am Miss Park, she said, her voice as flat and characterless as a dial tone. Mr. Yoon has restructured the household duties. I have been appointed as his personal attendant. You are to remain in the general staff quarters and oversee the laundry and the lower gardens. You are no longer required to enter the master suite or the private study. The words hit me like a physical blow, though I kept my expression a mask of warm, professional serenity. The rule of distance had begun. After the explosion of possessive fury the night before, Do-Jae was doing exactly what a man of his nature would do when he felt himself losing control. He was excising the variable. He was trying to turn me back into a ghost by hiring a machine to take my place. I see, I replied, my voice steady despite the sudden, hollow ache in my chest. Does Mr. Yoon know that the steam pressure must be released twice before pulling the shot? He prefers the crema to be thin, not bitter. I have been given a manual of his preferences, Miss Park said, finally looking at me with eyes that held no warmth, only a cold, professional curiosity. Detailed by Mr. Yoon himself. Your input is not necessary. I spent the next 3 days in a special kind of exile. I was still in the house, but I was no longer in his house. I moved through the lower gardens, my fingers treading through the damp earth and the falling leaves, while the life I had known for 2 years continued without me just a few floors above. I watched from the periphery as Do-Jae left for his meetings, flanked by his men in black. He didn't look toward the gardens. He didn't search for me in the reflections of the windows. He walked with a rigid military gait, his face an impenetrable mask of ice that told the world the savage was back in command. It was a performance and I knew it. But knowing it didn't stop the poison of being discarded from seeping into my veins. By the 4th day, the cracks in his new reality began to show, though only someone who had memorized him could see them. I was in the laundry room, folding the heavy Egyptian cotton sheets from the guest wing, when Miss Park entered. For the first time, her clinical composure was frayed. There was a faint tremor in her hands, and a small, dark stain on her gray sleeve. He sent the coffee back, she whispered, more to herself than to me. 3 times. He said the temperature was insulting. And he refused to wear the charcoal suit I laid out. He demanded the navy one, but then complained that the cufflinks were the wrong weight. I didn't offer a smile. I didn't offer comfort. I simply continued to fold the linen, the scent of lavender, his favorite scent for the bedding, filling the small room. I knew why the charcoal suit was wrong. He only wore charcoal when he had to go to the docks, because the fabric didn't show the salt spray. Today was a day for the courthouse, and for that, he needed the navy, the color of authority. And the cufflinks had to be the silver ones with the family crest, the heavy ones that reminded him of the weight of the name he carried. Ms. Park had a manual, but a manual couldn't teach the language of his moods. That evening, the rain began to fall, a cold, relentless Seoul autumn rain that turned the gardens into a graveyard of gray. I was finishing my duties in the library, a room I was still allowed to clean because Do-Jae rarely used it when he was in exile. I was reaching for a book on the top shelf when the heavy oak door creaked open. I didn't turn around. I knew the weight of that footstep. Do-Jae didn't speak. He stayed by the door, the scent of rain and expensive tobacco clinging to him. The silence between us was different now. It wasn't the pristine silence of a shadow and her master. It was the pressurized silence of a dam about to break. The gardens look well tended, he said finally. His voice was raspy, exhausted, stripped of the booming authority he had used to terrace the world. Thank you, Mr. Yoon. I said, my back still to him. The roses will survive the frost. Is that what you're doing, Isolde? He asked, and I could hear him moving closer, the slow, deliberate stride of a man who was fighting every instinct he possessed. Are you surviving the frost I've put between us? I finally turned, the book clutched to my chest like a shield. He looked terrible. The shadows under his piercing eyes were darker, and he had missed a button on his vest, a mistake he never made. He looked like a man who was starving in the middle of a banquet. I am following the rules of the house, I said, my voice barely a whisper. Rule 3, Mr. Yoon. I am a shadow. And shadows do not complain when the light moves. He was inches away from me now. He didn't touch me, but I could feel the heat radiating from him, a desperate, frantic energy that made my own breath hitch. He looked at me, really looked at me, and I saw the failure of his rule of distance. He had tried to replace me with a manual and a machine, but all he had done was make the silence louder. I can't breathe in this house when I don't know where you are, he confessed, the admission sounding like a jagged piece of glass being pulled from his throat. I see her moving in the kitchen. I see her setting my table. And all I can think is that her hands are the wrong color, her voice is the wrong pitch, and her heart isn't mine. He reached out, his hand hovering near my cheek but not quite touching it, as if he were afraid that if he closed the distance, he would never be able to pull away again. The savage was gone, replaced by a man who was drowning in the very distance he had created. This didn't work, did it? I asked softly. No, he whispered, his eyes closing as he leaned his forehead against the cool wood of the bookshelf beside my head. It only made me realize that the distance isn't a rule. It's a lie. And I'm tired of lying to the only person who actually sees me. The fortress of silence had not just been breached, it had been dismantled piece by piece, by the very man who had built it. As we stood there in the dim light of the library, the rain drumming against the glass, I realized that the rule of distance had only brought us to the edge of a precipice, and there was no longer any way to go but down. The laundry room was the only place where the scent of him still lingered without the sharp, clinical interference of Miss Park's presence. As I pressed the iron into the heavy silk of his ties, the steam rose in a warm, fragrant cloud of sandalwood and rain. It was the scent of my life for the last 2 years, a sensory anchor that had kept me grounded in the middle of a storm. But today the anchor was dragging. I had spent the morning in the lower gardens, my fingers stained with the dark, cold earth of the dormant rose bushes, but my mind had never left the library. The confession Do-Jae had made, the raw, broken admission that he couldn't breathe without knowing where I was, had stayed with me like a persistent fever. It was a breach in the fortress I wasn't prepared to mend. The breaking point didn't come with a shout or a dramatic confrontation. It came in the quiet, agonizing observation of a single hour in the late afternoon. I had been summoned to the upper floor to deliver the fresh linens for the guest wing, a task that technically kept me away from the master suite. But as I moved down the long, carpeted corridor, I saw the door to Do-Jae's private study standing ajar. I stopped, the heavy basket of lavender-scented sheets balanced against my hip, and I watched a scene that felt like a slow-motion collision. Ms. Park was there, moving through the room with her usual robotic efficiency. She was setting a tray on the mahogany desk, the same desk where I had spent countless hours ensuring every pen was aligned and every shadow was accounted for. Do-Jae was sitting in his leather chair, his back to her, his shoulders pulled tight toward his ears in a gesture of profound tension. He was rubbing his left temple. It was the tell, the silent signal of a migraine or a level of stress that bordered on the explosive. Miss Park didn't see it. Or if she did, she didn't understand the language of his body. She placed the espresso cup on the right side of the desk, the porcelain clinking against the wood with a jarring metallic sound. She didn't adjust the lighting to account for the glare on his monitor. She didn't move the heavy drapes to soften the harsh afternoon sun. She simply stood there, waiting for him to acknowledge her presence with the cold, professional distance he had demanded. "Your coffee, Mr. Yoon," she said, her voice flat and characterless. Do-Jae didn't move. He didn't speak. He simply continued to rub his temple, his jaw clenching so hard I could see the muscle jump from the hallway. The air in the room was vibrating with his suppressed savage energy, a pressure cooker that was seconds away from a lethal whistle. I felt a sudden, sharp pang in my chest, a physical ache that had nothing to do with the weight of the laundry basket. For 2 years, I had called it quiet confidence. I had told myself that my ability to move through his world, to anticipate the twitch of a muscle or the shift in his mood before he even realized it himself, was merely the mark of a superior servant. I had convinced myself that my stoicism was a professional requirement, a mask worn to survive the volatile nature of a mafia boss. But watching another woman stand in my space, watching her fail to see the man beneath the monster, I realized that I had been lying to myself for 730 days. The quiet confidence hadn't been professionalism. It had been love. It was a terrifying, inconvenient truth that settled into my bones with the weight of lead. I didn't just care for his estate. I cared for him. I had memorized the jagged poetry in his desk not because it was my duty, but because I wanted to understand the soul that the rest of the world was too afraid to look at. I had ensured his coffee was exactly 82 degrees not because of a manual, but because I couldn't stand the thought of him being even slightly uncomfortable in a world that constantly demanded his blood. I watched as Do-Jae finally snapped. He swiped his hand across the desk, sending the espresso cup flying. The porcelain shattered against the far wall, the dark liquid staining the expensive wallpaper. Ms. Park flinched, her clinical gray uniform suddenly looking small and inadequate against the backdrop of his fury. "Get out," he growled, the sound low and guttural. "Get out and don't come back in here until you learn how to walk without making a sound." Ms. Park retreated, her face pale, scurrying past me in the hallway without a glance. I stood there, hidden by the shadow of the linen closet, my heart hammering against my ribs. Do-Jae didn't turn around. He dropped his head into his hands, his fingers tangling in the dark silk of his hair. He looked small in that moment. A man who owned the city but couldn't find peace in his own home. The fortress of silence was gone. The rule of distance was a ruin. And as I stared at his slumped shoulders, I realized that the savage wasn't the only one who had lost control. By pretending to be invisible, I had allowed myself to fall for a man who lived in the dark, and now, there was no longer any light left to hide the truth. My mask of stoicism wasn't a shield, it was a cage, and the bars were finally starting to break. Midnight in the Do-Jae estate always felt like the world had been submerged in ink. The rain had slowed to a rhythmic, mournful weeping against the glass, and the rest of the staff had long since retreated to their quarters. I should have been asleep, but the revelation in the laundry room, the terrifying weight of my own heart, had made rest impossible. I found myself standing before the heavy, carved oak doors of the master suite. My hands were empty of trays or linens. I had no professional excuse to be here. The rule of distance remained a standing order, and yet, the silence coming from behind those doors was so loud it pulled at my very soul. I didn't knock. I simply pressed my palm against the wood and pushed. The room was bathed in the ghost light of a dying fire. The scent of sandalwood was overwhelming here, mixed with the sharp, metallic tang of the bourbon sitting in a heavy crystal glass on the nightstand. Do-Jae was not in bed. He was standing by the floor-to-ceiling window, his back to the room, his white shirt unbuttoned and hanging loose from his shoulders. He didn't turn around, but I saw his reflection in the dark glass. His eyes were closed, his forehead pressed against the pane. "I told Ms. Park to stay away," he said, his voice a jagged rasp that cut through the shadows. "If you've come to check the temperature of the room, don't bother. It's freezing, and I prefer it that way." "Ms. Park is asleep, Do-Jae," I said softly. He went deathly still. The reflection in the glass opened its eyes, piercing, dark, and suddenly wide with a shock that bordered on pain. He turned slowly, his movements erratic, as if he were a man waking from a long, feverish sleep. "Isolde," he whispered. The way he said my name had changed. It was no longer a command or a formal title. It was a prayer, a confession, and a plea all wrapped into one. He took a step toward me, then stopped, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. The firelight played across the jagged scars on his knuckles, the remnants of the glass he had shattered for me. "You shouldn't be here," he growled, though there was no savage bite left in the words. "I spent 4 days building a wall between us. I spent 4 days trying to remember how to be the man I was before you walked into this house." "And were you?" I asked, taking a step into the room. The distance between us felt like a live wire, humming with 2 years of suppressed energy. "Were you that man again? The one who doesn't feel the temperature of the coffee or the weight of the suit?" He laughed, a bitter, hollow sound that died in the back of his throat. I was a ghost. A king sitting on a throne of ice, starving for a shadow that refused to leave his mind. He moved then, crossing the room with a sudden, predatory speed that didn't frighten me. He stopped inches away, the heat of him hitting me like a physical wave. He reached out, his fingers trembling as they hovered just above the skin of my neck, tracing the line where my dark skin met the starch-white collar of my uniform. 730 days, he whispered, his voice breaking. "Do you think I don't know the count? 730 days of watching you move through these halls like a dream I wasn't allowed to touch. 730 days of pretending that my interest in you was professional, that my obsession was just quality control." I looked up at him, my mask of stoicism finally, irrevocably shattered. "You memorized me." "I memorized the sound of your breathing," he confessed, his hand finally closing the distance to cup my jaw. His thumb brushed over my lower lip, his touch possessing a desperate, raw honesty. "I memorized the exact shade of the honey in your eyes when the sun hits them on the terrace. I spent 2 years building a cage of rules to protect myself from you, Isolde. Not to protect you from me. From the moment you arrived, I was the one in danger." The confession hung in the midnight air, fragile and terrifying. The savage was gone. There was only Do-Jae, a man who had spent 2 years drowning in the presence of the woman he claimed was a shadow. "I thought I was being invisible," I whispered, leaning into his palm. "You were the only thing I could see," he replied, his eyes dark with a hunger that made my breath hitch. I looked at the city, I looked at my rivals, I looked at the blood on my hands, and all I wanted was to come home and find you standing in the light. Min-Joon didn't just touch you at that gala. He touched the only part of my life that isn't stained with sin. He touched the only thing that belongs to me because I love it, not because I conquered it." He leaned in, his forehead dropping to rest against mine. "I love you so much it feels like a curse, Isolde. I love you so much I tried to replace you with a machine just so I wouldn't have to face the fact that I am completely, hopelessly yours." The silence of the master suite wasn't a fortress anymore. It was a bridge. I reached up, my fingers tangling in the dark silk of his hair, pulling him closer until the space between us was gone. "I'm not a shadow anymore, Do-Jae," I said, my voice steady with the quiet confidence that was finally truly mine. "No," he whispered, his lips brushing against mine. "You're the sun. And I've been in the dark for far too long." When he finally kissed me, it wasn't a master claiming a servant. It was an explosion, a desperate, consuming collision of 2 years of longing, of secret stares, and of a love that had grown in the silence until it was strong enough to level an empire. The master suite was no longer a place of rigid order and mafia secrets. It was the site of a transformation. As the fire died in the hearth, I realized that the maid who had entered at midnight was never coming back, and the man who held her was no longer a monster, but a man who had finally found something worth fighting for. The morning after the midnight confession felt as though the world had been painted in a new, terrifyingly vibrant palette. The rain had ceased, leaving the estate gardens draped in a heavy, silver mist that clung to the dormant roses like a shroud. I stood by the window of the master suite, wrapped in one of Do-Jae's silk robes, watching the fog roll over the stone walls I had once considered my fortress. The silence was no longer heavy with suppressed longing. It was thick with the weight of a commitment that neither of us could ever take back. Do-Jae was gone before the sun had fully crested the horizon, summoned to an emergency meeting regarding the fallout of the peace dinner. He had lingered at the door for 10 minutes, his hand clutching my waist as if he were trying to fuse our shadows together. He didn't want to leave. The savage, who had once prided himself on his iron-fisted control over the city, had looked at me with eyes that were raw and bloodshot, whispering promises of a future where I would never have to carry a tray again. He had left Mr. Han and 4 of his best men stationed directly outside the suite, a visible reminder that I was no longer an invisible servant, but the heart of his empire. I chose to go to the lower gardens in the late afternoon. It was my sanctuary, the place where I felt most like Isolde and least like a pawn in a game of blood. The earth was cold and damp beneath my boots, and the air smelled of wet stone and dying leaves. I needed the grounding rhythm of the soil to process the fact that I was now the sun in Yoon Do-Jae's universe. I was kneeling by the frost-bitten lilies, my fingers stained with the dark loam, when the silence of the garden shifted. It wasn't a loud sound, just the soft, rhythmic crunch of gravel that didn't match the heavy, military cadence of Mr. Han's footsteps. I stood up slowly, wiping my hands on my apron, my heart beginning a slow, heavy thrum against my ribs. The mist was thick here, blurring the edges of the topiary into monstrous shapes. "Mr. Han," I called out, my voice steady despite the sudden chill crawling up my spine. No answer. Only the sound of the wind whistling through the empty branches. I turned to head back toward the main house, my pace quickening. I reached the edge of the stone terrace when a figure stepped out from behind a weeping willow. It wasn't one of Do-Jae's men. This man wore a suit that was too sharp for a bodyguard, and carried a smile that felt like a predator's snarl. "The most protected woman in Seoul," a voice drawled from behind me. I spun around to find Baek Min-Joon leaning against a stone pillar, a cigarette dangling from his lips. He looked exactly as he had at the dinner, smooth, oily, and entirely too comfortable. But the charm was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating focus that made my blood turn to ice. "Mr. Baek," I said, my voice like iron, "you are trespassing." "Am I?" He took a long drag of the cigarette, the ember glowing like a malevolent eye in the gray light. "I prefer to think of it as reclaiming an interest. Do-Jae is a fool, Isolde. He thinks that by putting men at your door he can protect the one thing he's finally admitted he loves. But he forgot that a fortress is only as strong as its weakest entrance." Before I could scream, before I could even draw a breath to call for help, 2 men emerged from the mist behind me. One of them clamped a gloved hand over my mouth, the scent of chemicals and stale tobacco overwhelming the smell of the earth. I fought, my quiet confidence exploding into a desperate, frantic struggle. I drove my heel into a shin and clawed at the arm across my face, but they were machines of meat and bone, unmoved by my resistance. Min-Joon stepped closer, his fingers reaching out to brush a stray lock of hair from my forehead. His touch was cold, devoid of the desperate, burning heat that defined Do-Jae. Tell him, when he finds the note, that the Gangnam docks are a small price to pay for a secret this exquisite, Min-Joon whispered against my ear. The world tilted as a needle pricked the side of my neck. The gardens, the stone walls, and the memory of Do-Jae's kiss began to dissolve into a dark, swirling abyss. My last thought, as the darkness swallowed me whole, was of the shattered glass in Do-Jae's hand and the terrible, savage fire that was about to consume the city. 2 hours later, Yoon Do-Jae returned to an estate that was no longer a home, but a crime scene. He found Mr. Han unconscious in the hallway and the lower gardens silent, save for the discarded trowel lying in the mud near the crushed lilies. In the center of the master suite, pinned to the very pillow where Isolde's head had rested only hours before, was a single elegant card embossed with the Baek family crest. The message was brief. The pawn is in my hand. If you want her back with her breath still in her lungs, the Gangnam docks are mine by midnight. No police. No guards. Just the deed and your pride. Do-Jae didn't scream. He didn't break the furniture. He stood in the center of the room, his white shirt pristine, his face a mask of such absolute, frozen calm that his men were too terrified to even breathe. He reached out and picked up the discarded silk robe Isolde had worn that morning, pressing it to his face. It still smelled of sandalwood and rain. When he finally looked up, his eyes weren't just dark, they were voids. The savage had been a mask he wore to rule the city, but the man who stood there now was something else entirely. He was a man who had lost his son. And as he reached for the heavy, black handgun on his nightstand, the city of Seoul began to tremble. Baek Min-Joon had wanted to steal a pawn, but he had mistakenly invited a demon into his house. And by midnight, there would be no peace left to negotiate. The silence that followed the discovery of the ransom note was not a lack of sound, but a void where the soul of the Do-Jae estate had once been. Within the walls of the master suite, the air had turned frigid, the scent of sandalwood and rain now a haunting eulogy for a woman who had become his entire world. Yoon Do-Jae did not move for a long time. He stood over the bed, his fingers still tracing the indentation in the pillow where Isolde's head had rested, his eyes vacant and terrifying. In the world of the Seoul underworld, there was a protocol for situations like this. There were intermediaries to call, neutral territories to establish, and negotiations regarding the Gangnam docks that should have taken hours of careful, bloodless maneuvering. To the council, Isolde Marrow was a maid, a high-value asset, perhaps, but a pawn nonetheless. Protocol dictated that Do-Jae should trade the territory for the girl, settle the score later, and maintain the balance of power. But Yoon Do-Jae was no longer a politician, and he certainly wasn't a pawn. "Sir," Mr. Han whispered, his voice trembling as he stood by the door, his face bruised from the encounter in the garden. "The council is on the line. They want to know your decision regarding the docks. They say the stability of the northern district depends on." The sound of Do-Jae's fist hitting the mahogany desk was like a thunderclap. He didn't turn around. "Tell the council that the northern district is dead to me. Tell them that every rule they have ever written is ash." He finally turned, and even Mr. Han, who had stood by his side through the bloodiest coups in the city's history, flinched. The savage was gone, replaced by something ancient and hollow. Do-Jae's eyes were bloodshot, the dark circles beneath them making him look like a ghost fueled by nothing but spite. He didn't reach for his phone. He reached for a heavy, black tactical vest and the leather holster that held the weight of his legacy. "We aren't going to the docks to sign a deed," Do-Jae said, his voice a low, guttural vibration that made the glass in the windows hum. "We are going to burn every structure that bears the Baek name. If Min-Joon wanted to play with fire, I will give him an inferno." The rampage began at 8 p.m. Do-Jae abandoned the black SUVs and the inconspicuous sedans. He led a convoy of armored vehicles through the rain-slicked streets of Seoul, ignoring every red light and every territorial boundary. He didn't start with Min-Joon's headquarters. He started with the warehouses, the lungs of Min-Joon's empire. The first building, a massive shipping container depot near the Han River, went up in a pillar of orange flame within minutes. Do-Jae didn't wait for his men to clear the perimeter. He walked through the front gates, his handgun an extension of his arm, firing with a lethal mechanical precision that left no room for mercy. He didn't ask questions. He didn't offer terms. He simply moved through the smoke like a demon in a suit, his eyes searching every corner, every shadow, for the woman who had become his light. "Where is she?" he asked a captured lieutenant, his hand tightening around the man's throat until the sound of straining cartilage filled the burning room. I don't know. Min-Joon moved her. He said you'd come here first." Do-Jae didn't blink. He threw the man into the rising flames and walked back into the night, the heat of the fire reflecting in his dark, void-like eyes. He was a man who had spent 2 years perfecting the art of the invisible boss, but tonight he was the most visible force in the city. He was a beacon of destruction. By 10 p.m., 3 more Baek properties were in ruins. The city's elite watched from their penthouses as the skyline was dotted with the glow of Yoon Do-Jae's grief. The protocol was dead. The balance was gone. He was burning millions of dollars in assets, destroying decades of carefully negotiated peace, all for a woman the world thought was a servant. He didn't care about the money. He didn't care about the docks. He only cared about the scent of sandalwood and rain. At the 5th warehouse, a sprawling textile factory on the edge of the district, Do-Jae finally found the lead he needed. He stood in the center of a scorched office, his white shirt now stained with soot and the blood of men who had tried to stand in his way. He held a phone he had retrieved from a dying guard, his thumb scrolling through the last sent locations. "Incheon," he whispered, the word sounding like a death sentence. He looked at Mr. Han, who was standing behind him, covered in the grime of a war that had no rules left. "He's taken her to the old shipyard. He thinks the water will hide him." "Sir, the council. They've sent their own enforcers to stop you. They say you're destroying the city's economy. They're threatening to strip your title if you don't stop now." Do-Jae reached into his pocket and pulled out the silver cufflinks, the heavy ones with the family crest that Isolde had meticulously polished every morning. He looked at them for a long moment, the silver reflecting the dying embers of the warehouse. "Let them take the title," Do-Jae said, his voice surprisingly soft, yet harder than any diamond. "They can have the city. They can have the docks. But they will never, as long as I have breath in my lungs, have her." He walked out of the burning factory, the sirens of the city wailing in the distance like a chorus of the damned. He didn't look back at the destruction he had wrought. He looked toward the west, toward the sea, where the woman he loved was being held by a man who didn't understand that a savage has nothing left to lose once his heart has been stolen. The shipyard was waiting, and as Do-Jae stepped into his car, the final act of the war began. He wasn't going there to negotiate. He was going there to end the Baek bloodline, and he wouldn't stop until Isolde Marrow was back in the only place she belonged. In the light of a world he would burn to the ground just to see her smile again. The Incheon shipyard was a skeletal graveyard of rusted steel and salt-crusted silence by the time the final echoes of gunfire faded into the churning gray of the Yellow Sea. The air was thick with the scent of ozone, spent shells, and the overwhelming, metallic tang of a war that had finally reached its end. In the center of the derelict dry dock, bathed in the strobe-like flickers of dying emergency lights, Yoon Do-Jae stood like a monument to a god of ruin. His white shirt was no longer white. It was a map of soot and the dark, drying stains of men who had underestimated the depth of a savage's grief. He didn't look at the body of Baek Min-Joon, nor did he look at the wreckage of the empire he had systematically dismantled in a single night of fire. His entire world was narrowed down to the woman in his arms. Isolde felt the tremors racking his massive frame. Not tremors of fear, but the violent aftershock vibrations of a man who had pushed past every human limit to reclaim his soul. She was wrapped in his tactical jacket, the heavy Kevlar still warm from his body, her face pressed against the hollow of his neck. The scent of sandalwood and rain was still there, buried beneath the grime of the shipyard, and it was the only thing that kept the world from spinning into the abyss. The ride back to the estate was a passage through a city that seemed to be holding its breath. The black convoy moved through the pre-dawn streets of Seoul, like a funeral procession for the old world. Inside the car, Do-Jae didn't speak. He held Isolde's hand with a grip so fierce it was almost painful, his thumb tracing the bruises on her wrists with a frantic, repetitive motion. He looked out the window at the flickering streetlights, his piercing eyes hollowed out by an exhaustion that went deeper than bone. When they finally crossed the threshold of the Do-Jae estate, the fortress of silence felt different. The rigid, clinical order that had defined the house for 2 years had been incinerated. The staff moved in the shadows, their eyes wide with a new kind of terror. Not of the savage boss, but of the man who had proven he would burn the very ground they stood on for the woman they had once called a servant. Do-Jae didn't take her to the servants' quarters. He didn't even stop at the infirmary. He carried her directly to the master suite, kicking the heavy oak doors shut with a finality that signaled the end of the rule of distance. The room was quiet, the fire in the hearth reduced to a soft, orange glow. Do-Jae set her down on the edge of the bed, his bed, and knelt between her knees. He didn't call for a doctor. He reached for the medical kit himself, his hands, usually so steady with a blade or a gun, shaking as he pulled out the antiseptic. "I thought I had lost you," he whispered, the words sounding like they were being dragged over broken glass. He didn't look up at her. He focused on the small cut on her cheek, his touch so light it was almost a ghost of a caress. The mask of the savage was gone, left behind in the burning warehouses of the northern district. The man sitting on the floor was raw, fragmented, and utterly exposed. "I'm here, Do-Jae," Isolde said, her voice a soft, steady anchor in the dark. She reached out, her fingers tangling in his dark, soot-stained hair, forcing him to look at her. "I'm right here." Do-Jae dropped the antiseptic, his head falling into her lap as he let out a jagged, broken sob. It was a sound that shouldn't have come from a man like him. A sound of a fortress finally collapsing. "I can't do this anymore, Isolde," he confessed into the fabric of her skirt. "I spent my whole life being a monster so that no one could ever take anything from me. I thought that if I was cold enough, if I was savage enough, I would be untouchable. But tonight I realized that I am the most vulnerable man in this city." He looked up at her, his dark eyes wet with a desperation that made her heart ache. "You are my weakness." The admission hung in the air, heavy and terrifying. In his world, a weakness was a death sentence. To love something was to give your enemies a handle to turn the blade. By admitting his love, he was admitting that he was no longer the untouchable king of the Seoul underworld. He was a man with a target over his heart. "They saw it," Do-Jae continued, his voice rising with a frantic intensity. "Min-Joon saw it. The council saw it. They know that to destroy me, all they have to do is touch you. I've made you a target, Isolde. I've dragged you into the dark because I was too selfish to let you go." He gripped her waist, his fingers digging into her skin. "I should send you away. I should put you on a plane and never look at you again. That's what a leader would do. That's what protocol demands." Isolde looked at the man who had burned down half of Seoul to find her. She saw the scars on his hands, the soot on his brow, and the raw, bleeding love in his eyes. She thought of the 2 years she had spent pretending to be a shadow, pretending that she didn't see the man beneath the monster. The masks were gone. There was no more savage boss and quiet maid. There were only 2 people in a room, stripped bare by the fire. "You think I'm a weakness?" Isolde asked, her voice dropping to a low, melodic tone that commanded the air around them. She reached down and cupped his face, her thumbs wiping away the soot and the tears. "You think that because you love me, you are less than you were?" "I am killable now," he whispered. "No," Isolde replied, her quiet confidence transforming into something harder, something possessive and regal. "You are not killable. Because from this moment on, you are not fighting alone." She leaned down, her forehead pressing against his. "You spent 2 years protecting me from the shadows, Do-Jae. You spent tonight burning the world to save me. But you forgot one thing." She pulled back just enough to look him in the eye. her gaze as fierce and unwavering as his had ever been. I am not a pawn, and I will never be your weakness. Do-Jae stared at her, the confusion in his eyes slowly being replaced by a flickering hope. A king is only as strong as the queen beside him, Isolde said, her voice a vow that resonated through the master suite. If they want to get to you, they have to go through me. If they want to find a crack in your armor, they will find only me, standing guard. I will be your strength, Do-Jae. I will be the eyes you don't have in the back of your head. I will be the heart that keeps you human when the world tries to turn you back into a monster. She stood up, pulling him with her until they were standing eye to eye. The power dynamic of the estate shifted in that moment, the foundation of their lives settling into a new, unshakable alignment. No more masks, she commanded. No more shadows. If you want me, you take all of me. Not as your maid, not as your secret, but as your partner. We face the council together. We face the city together. Do-Jae looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the woman he had been obsessed with for 730 days. He didn't see a maid. He saw a force of nature. He saw the only person in the world who wasn't afraid of the savage, because she was the one who had tamed him. Together, he whispered, the words sounding like a new beginning. He pulled her into his arms, his kiss no longer desperate and consuming, but deep, committed, and full of a quiet, lethal power. The shipyard was a memory. The rival was ash. And as the sun finally began to bleed over the Seoul skyline, the fortress of silence became a palace, ruled by a man who had finally found his heart, and a woman who had finally found her throne. 1 year after the fires had ceased and the shipyard had been left to the salt and the ghosts, the Do-Jae estate did not feel like a fortress of silence. It felt like a living, breathing heart. The rigid, clinical lines of the past had been softened by the presence of a woman who had refused to remain a shadow. The rule of distance was a relic of a dead age, replaced by an intimacy so profound it was visible in every corner of the house, from the fresh sandalwood in the air to the genuine smiles of a staff that no longer lived in fear of a monster. The day of the wedding arrived with a sky the color of crushed sapphires, clear and vast over the city of Seoul. It was more than a union. It was a coronation. The underworld, the corporate elite, and the high-ranking members of the council had all gathered in the estate's grand courtyard. Their whispers a low hum of disbelief and reluctant awe. They had come to see the savage surrender, but they found themselves standing in the presence of a king who had finally found his crown. Isolde stood before the full-length mirror in the master suite, the very room where the truth had once been whispered in the dark. She was a vision of cultural fusion and regal power, wearing a gown of deep obsidian silk that clung to her curves like a second skin, embroidered with gold thread in the patterns of both her heritage and his. She wore no mask of stoicism today. Her face was radiant, her quiet confidence, now an undisputed authority that commanded the room without a single word. She was no longer a maid in a starched uniform. She was the Queen of Seoul, the woman who had walked through the fire and emerged as the only thing Yoon Do-Jae was afraid to lose. When the heavy oak doors opened, and she began her walk down the aisle, the silence that fell over the courtyard was absolute. Do-Jae stood at the end of the path, a man transformed. He wore a traditional black hanbok tailored with modern lethal precision, his dark hair swept back to reveal the piercing intensity of his eyes. To the council, he still looked like the savage, the man who had burned down half the city in a single night of grief. But as Isolde approached, they saw the shift. They saw the way his shoulders, usually a rigid line of suppressed violence, softened. They saw the way his hands, capable of ending lives with mechanical efficiency, trembled as he reached out to take hers. He didn't wait for the officiant to speak. He didn't follow the protocol he had spent a lifetime enforcing. He pulled her close, his forehead dropping to rest against hers in a gesture that had become their private language. 730 days of silence, he whispered, his voice a low, melodic vibration that only she could hear. And every single one was leading to this. I spent my life building walls, Isolde. I thought the dark was the only place I belonged. But you didn't just break the walls. You burned them down and taught me how to live in the light. Isolde reached up, her fingers tracing the faint, silvery scar on his jaw. A reminder of the night he had reclaimed her. I told you I would be your strength, Do-Jae. I told you that you would never have to fight alone again. You are more than my strength, he replied, his voice breaking with an emotional honesty that stunned the watching crowd. You are the only reason I want to be a man instead of a monster. I feared losing you more than I feared death, and in that fear, I finally found my life. I am yours, Isolde. Completely. Irrevocably. Always. As they exchanged their vows, the city of Seoul watched. They saw the savage boss kneel before his bride, not out of weakness, but out of a devotion that was more powerful than any gun or any dock. It was a declaration of war against the old ways. A promise that the Do-Jae Empire would no longer be ruled by fear, but by the lethal, protective love of a man and a woman who had seen the worst of the world and chosen each other anyway. The celebration that followed was a beautiful, chaotic fusion of worlds. There were traditional Korean drummers and the smooth, soulful R&B that Isolde loved. There were toasts from men with scarred knuckles and tears from the mother of the man who had once been a monster. And in the center of it all, Do-Jae and Isolde moved as one. Their shadows finally fused together under the light of the Seoul moon. Years later, the story of the flowers and the jealousy would be a legend in the city. A story of how a savage had been tamed by the woman he tried to pretend was invisible. But for Do-Jae and Isolde, the story was much simpler. It was the story of sandalwood and rain. It was the story of a shadow that became a sun. And as they stood on the balcony of their home, watching their son, Leo, sleep in the nursery, a boy who would grow up knowing his father's smile instead of his father's fist, Do-Jae pulled his queen close. Remember when you were a shadow? He asked quietly, pressing a kiss to her temple. Isolde smiled, leaning her head on his shoulder as the city glittered beyond the windows. I remember. But the dark was never really our home, Do-Jae. We were just waiting for the fire to show us the way out. The fortress of silence was gone, and in its place was a legacy of love that would outlast the docks, the warehouses, and the secrets of the night. The savage had been tamed, but in his surrender, he had become the most powerful man Seoul had ever seen, because he was a man who truly had something worth living for.